May I now humbly request Shri Dilip Chenoy, ex-General Secretary, FICCI, to kindly join us here on the dais.
So good afternoon. First of all, thank you, AICRA and Raj, for inviting me here. I'm going to take a different tack because what I interpreted the topic to mean was, how do you change the landscape to enable STEM education to be interdisciplinary? And that means that given the current constraints of the existing curriculum, the existing class hours, the existing examination pattern, and the current progression, what is it that we could do? So that's the first thing which I'm going to talk about. And the second is that if you have to change the entire system, what could be some of the things and how do you integrate it into the new national education policy? So if I'm diverging from the perceived topic, please excuse me. I can always answer questions in that. So if you're looking at interdisciplinary, right, and I think my colleague from the armed forces actually said everybody works in silos, right? So if there's a history class which is going on, if I'm in a class, let's say in school, and someone's teaching me history, and in the science somebody is talking about making gunpowder, there's no relation of how the gunpowder changed the course of history, right? And all you got to do to make it interdisciplinary is get the two teachers to talk about how gunpowder actually changed the direction of civilization, if I can say, in the science class, and the person in the history class talks about the science of gunpowder. That's the simple way of, you actually use the existing teachers to bring in a cross-disciplinary way. Okay, if I can just say that you're talking about civics and or you're talking about mathematics or you're talking about English, right? So I'll give you a real-life example from a kids' school in Chennai. So they want to teach the kids in the school the science of baking. So they actually take the kids into a bakery, which is a few 100 yards from their school, and the kids get involved in making their own pizzas. It's a pizzeria, right? And the science teacher and the class teacher actually explain the entire science behind making a pizza. Now, in doing some fun activity, they actually learn about yeast rising, about the correct temperature for baking, and they learn a whole sort of science and even technology and mathematic principles that they would have never come to know in the classroom. And of course, then each one is given money, right? So they have to buy the pizza. So a person is actually managing, one of the young kids, they're all of 8 years old, 8 to 9 years old, right? They are managing the cashier counter, he's doing the cash, he's doing the maths, etc. So you're including all of this in a regular classroom. And it doesn't take an extra class, because what is sure that you have 8 periods or 10 periods, depending whether they're 45 minutes or 1 hour or whatever the duration of a class is, 35 minutes in some cases, in a day. But by the time you go to sleep and you get up the next morning, knowledge is actually doubled. So you have to choose what you want to put into the classroom as you go forward. So the first thing is that when you want to integrate and do an interdisciplinary kind of approach to STEM, you've got to think of the curriculum. You need not change the curriculum, but you got to take different parts of the curriculum and to see how do you put it in the classroom. And this is where the teachers have to collaborate, right? So, ideally what could happen is that if you're teaching history and gunpowder, the example I go back, the science teacher comes and teaches the history class. Right? Easier said than done, because everybody looks, and sometimes the school will not allow it, or even if it's in university system and you have someone teaching one subject into the other, the university system does not allow it. So you actually have to talk about the curriculum and the classroom. Two changes both in the hands of the existing principal, existing timetable, committee, existing class teacher, or if you go into college, head of department, or whatever it is. You can extrapolate it from any way that you want. The third area, first is curriculum, second is classroom, right? And if I can just go back to the classroom for a minute, if you look at Finland in school, right? And Finland is ranked as the 4th most difficult schooling system in the world. Japan, South Korea, one more in Finland, right? They actually have 3 classes of 45 minutes in a week. The rest of the time they're in school and they are doing things what you talked about. Experimentation, doing a lot of other stuff, and it's a freewheeling kind of a thing, right? Now you can't, if you implement that currently in India today, people will, make different comments, etc., etc. But I'm just saying it is possible to actually change the curriculum, change the way that we teach in the classroom to enable STEM education to be actually, even imbibed in the existing classroom. To give you an example of a college, right? So just day before yesterday, I was with some students of history, and they said, actually the most interesting history book on art and culture is actually written by a professor whose specialization was statistics. And one of the earlier persons who wrote, wrote on the education scenario in India, right? How many kilometers each school is from a habitation, how many have toilets, how many have boundary walls. The person who did that work was a geographer, right? So you can actually have people who have done this. We need to give the younger people the opportunity to do that. The third element I want to talk about is certification, right? And the colleague from the DGT was here, and he talked about he was a controller of examination. Actually, we tend to certify and examine in a preconceived manner. I was listening with a lot of interest that he says that there are, objective type questions, right? And, as part of some research that I'm doing, I have actually taken courses on 14 online education, like Coursera, Unacademy, all these, 14 of them. And I've tried to take the same course. And what is interesting is the way they evaluate you. It's all through quizzes. And to answer that quiz, even if you got the book in front of you, to do it in the time that you have, if you don't know the subject, right, you aren't going to actually succeed. And therefore, the certification and the questions that are asked with you, we've actually got to have a new generation of examination. There's this whole debate about formative learning and summative assessment things, but it has to be a combination of that. So if we have to transform the landscape and get STEM education, right, to schools, to colleges, to universities, to research, right, we have to focus on these things. And let me end by giving you an example. And I'm going to take a very, very different example. I'm going to take about sports. I'm going to take about how do you take, during the play school, so how do you teach kids about Olympics, right? The way to do it is focus on the 5 rings, right? What color are the rings? What size are the rings? How do they come together? This is the symbol of the Olympics. So you're teaching a kid before elementary school what it is all about. Then when you come into elementary school, you're talked about, what is your good to eat, what you should eat, what you should not eat, etc., etc. So they ask kids to draw a food chart. What should be the food chart of a young kid who wants to become an athlete? So he learns about carbohydrates, proteins, balancing it, does maths, etc., etc. Elementary school. You come into one step higher. Okay, if you have different athletes performing, you recently, Neeraj Chopra was, in the news, he won the javelin throw in Finland. So how do you draw a Venn diagram about the performance of different athletes? It's the same thing. The guy is interested in sports. How do you draw a Venn diagram about India's performance in the FIH Pro Hockey League, the women's and the men's kind of a thing? Then you go into university, right? You say, okay, what is the relationship of the structure of the physical structure of an athlete before he becomes a professional and after he becomes a professional? In fact, in people who study birds, right, they actually, if you're looking at migratory birds from India and Siberia, there are people who study the structure of the bird when they come and land, let's say in Bharatpur, and the structure of the bird when they leave from Bharatpur. And the structure is very different. They come in lean, they go in with a lot more of, mass and fat, etc., etc. So then if you want to take it even one level further, you can take up in, what are the, statistical dimensions of the body that will make a good athlete, right? So I'm just giving a very, very small example of how do you integrate science and technology into a thing like sports. And this could be done in your physical education class. It's not necessarily for you to get into another class here. So the whole thing is that what we want to do, right, is pretty simple. What needs to be done can be easily defined. I think the will is that the teachers, the parents, and the students need to collaborate. Because if the parents say, hey, CBSE is not going to ask the exam, what are the 5 rings of the Olympics? They might come in the general knowledge section of the entrance exam to JEE or to the IAS, but the parents don't know that, right? So the parents also have to agree to know what is good for their students in terms of doing this. So I think if we really want to change the landscape in this space, we need to focus on how do we get collaboration and joint working on the curriculum. How do we reformat the classrooms, make them much more exciting places to be, where the children learn on themselves. We just mentioned about how do they shadow people, how do they go around with other people, how do they learn on the job. And then you need to look at certification across this, and you need to know how do we progress from the kindergarten to actually PhD, and you believe, and what we know in skills is actually now known as the National Vocational Education Qualification Framework, where we have different levels and you integrate STEM into each level. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much once again for this opportunity, and very happy to take any questions later. Thank you.